Well, good afternoon and welcome to this live stream. I've got four expert panelists who are going to join us in a minute. And I'd like to invite you to type into the chat box where you are joining us from today so that we know where the audience is, and also any questions that you have for our panelists. So the relationship between the US and China is a complicated one. And by all accounts, it's entering a new phase. Investments from China into U.S. companies and operations have long been subject to federal review by the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, it's commonly called CFIUS. And now the Biden administration is looking to make investments going the other way from U.S. companies investing into China, also subject to review. And according to many sources, the new executive order is being drafted and is to be issued soon. It's being called reverse CFIUS. So the Biden administration's purpose is to check Chinese ambitions, especially when fields like AI and quantum computing, with national security obviously being the main driver. But what do the expected regulations mean for U.S. investors? Today, there's a lot of outbound transactions conducted by venture capital and private equity and U.S. investors into Chinese investment opportunities, right? And by many accounts, nearly half of these transactions will be subject to this new set of regulations. So we've got four experts here today to talk to us about this. So I'm Brett Waters. I've spent my entire life in Silicon Valley, immersed in the world of entrepreneurship, innovation, and venture capital. And when I want to go have lunch in Palo Alto and talk about things going on in the world with somebody smart, one of the first people I call is often Louie Lowe. Good afternoon, Louie.
Brett, thank you so much for helping us put this show together. And I'm really excited to have such a great group of experts join us and help us Silicon Valley guys figure out how to navigate this environment that we're in. But, you know, Brett, I think one of the most significant changes of Silicon Valley over the last 20 years has been the rise and importance of Asian capital, as well as Asian markets for our technology companies who launch products in all directions. And we've talked about CFIUS, and we're not talking about the medical condition for years, but we've got something coming down the pike, which I think is really important. And I'm just so delighted to have this group with us, which I'll let you introduce.
Awesome. You want to give us the brief background on you first, Louie, which I don't think you did
yet. I'm a Silicon Valley lawyer. I help companies get formed, financed, scaled for growth, bought and sold, and I help a lot of corporate investors and public and private equity firms invest capital in new businesses, and I have a lot of fun doing it with smart people like the folks we have today. Christopher.
Also joining us is Chris, one of Louie's partners.
Louie, Brad, thank you so much for inviting me to join this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Christopher Swift, and along with Louie, I'm a partner at Foley Lardner. I split my time between our Washington, D.C. and New York offices. I'm a white-collar lawyer and a national security lawyer. And so what does that mean? That means my practice deals with any time a company, whether it's early stage or otherwise, has to interface with the U.S. national security community. About half of that is white-collar defense and investigations involving scary things you might see in the headlines. The other half of that is running a very, very active CFIUS practice where we're turning, 20 to 30 filings a year before the committee and its constituent agencies. So my practice looks like what would happen if a Tom Clancy novel and a John Grisham novel were to get squished together. And a lot of the counseling that we do for clients, both strategic business planning, dovetails very, very closely with the issues that Brett and Louie have outlined. I also have a PhD in political science and spent my pre-law career in and around the U.S. national security with stints at the White House and Treasury, and also with various think tanks here in Washington. So we can do the policy and the law, and also show you where the law is not consistent with the policy and give you a sense of what's coming next.
Nice. Welcome, Chris. And also joining us is H.K. Park. Hey, H.K.
Hi, Brett. Thank you very much. Greetings from Washington, D.C. My name is H.K. Park. I'm a managing director at Crumpton Global here in Washington. I came from the Defense Department where I was a policy advisor, and I'm currently at a firm comprised mostly of former intelligence agency executives. We spent a lot of time vetting investors and foreign acquisition targets. And most recently, we've been actually working with Foley Lardner to help some VCs prepare for this new regulation coming down the pike.
Very nice. And finally, joining us live from Taipei, Kirk Gibbs. Hey, Kirk.
Greetings. Good morning. Good morning, Brett. Yeah, it's 6 a.m. here in Taipei. Delighted to be here. Thank you so much for convening the group, and also appreciate the folks at Foley for convening. So yeah, as you mentioned, Brett, my name is Kirk Gibbs, and I've been living in China for the last 19 years, and most recently as the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. And actually, just a quick comment about, and then my previous life is as a banker. I worked for HSBC doing technology deals throughout Asia Pacific. And just a quick comment about what Louie mentioned. Is the macro trend. Is the shift in attention to Asia, both as inbound and outbound investments, but then also, I think also the other macro trend that's happening is businesses being reluctantly pulled into the national security sphere. And so similar to Christopher covering sort of law and public policy, I sort of cover public policy and business. And that's really been a struggle for the American business community in China, just a very reluctant pull in that direction.
Right. So, Kirk, maybe we could start by giving us the update on where things stand with this executive order. This thing has been kind of rumored for a while. There's a piece in Axios last week about it, but it seems to be a pretty fluid situation. So maybe you could give us the update on what you know about it.
Sure. Yeah, it is a fluid situation, but it is, the momentum is definitely there. And so I don't think there's any question that something is going to happen. What shape and form is that going to take? I think the folks that are sitting in Washington, D.C. might have a better grasp for the timing of it and how it's going to shape out. But the larger context for this really is the national security, how to think about CFIUS and reverse CFIUS, and also in the context of the export controls. And there's a larger trend going on here. And everybody is concerned about China and the potential threat that it causes to stability in the region. And
right.
That's not why I'm here in Taiwan right now, but Taiwan is very much the focal point of that threat. So the things that have happened recently, Taiwan itself has recently reinstated a mandatory military service for their people. Japan doubling their defense budget, which was just a major move for Japan to do that.
Right.
And then of course the U.S. and China increasingly appearing to prepare for increased competition or maybe even confrontation. So in the larger context for this, again, I think both governments are, as I mentioned, are getting business more and more involved in the national security sphere. So just a quick comment about China, and then also in the U.S. I want to read a quote from Tony Blinken that I think sets the context for this conversation. On the China side, it's less new. There's always been this connection between business and government and national security, and they've been cracking down on the tech businesses and these things. So in China, it's less of a new phenomenon. But the Tony Blinken quote that I want to share with people, and again, Louie and I have shared this with some of his clients, and it always kind of gets people's attention. But about a year ago, when the Secretary of State was sort of teeing up the Biden administration's policy towards China, he inserted this quote in his speech, and it got a lot of attention from the American business community in China. So he said, and I'm going to read it to you. He said, "We believe and we expect the business community to understand that the price of admission to China's market must not be the sacrifice of our core values or long-term competitive and technological advantages. We're counting on businesses to pursue growth responsibly, assess risks soberly, and work with us not only to protect but to strengthen our national security." So that's the context for kind of where the CFIUS rules and now reverse CFIUS and export controls kind of land. So we can talk more about the details there.
And I think Blinken is due to visit China like next month, and that's part of the driver. I think they want to get the CEO out beforehand. Is that right?
He is. He's due to visit China, which is huge. I mean, that's a great step and a positive step. The interaction between Biden and Xi was also positive. There's also Liu He and Janet Yellen met, I think, a few hours ago in Davos. That's also a good step. But it was also interesting, and again, this sets the context for I think reverse CFIUS, is Liu He's comments at Davos. I mean, he's very much he's in sales mode right now, and there's a reason for that. He's selling mode, trying to get international investors back into the China market after this 3-year nightmare, frankly, of zero COVID. And the reason for that, I mean, in the last 20 years or so, we've seen a shift in terms of how much China needs foreign investment. They went from really needing it in the early days, going all the way back to Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, to sort of wanting it, but not necessarily needing it. They were not capital starved. Now they're back. Now they're back to a situation where they very much need investment, no matter where it comes from. And we've seen in the last few weeks, we've seen this dynamic between the central government actually provides a lot of the funding that keeps the provinces afloat. And zero COVID has been devastating at the provincial level in terms of budgets. I mean, everybody focuses on the human cost and the inconvenience of these lockdowns, but let's talk about the cost. I mean, it's you shut down your economy. At the same time, you need to employ an army of people to impose these controls. And then let's not forget about the cost of the test kits themselves. When you start testing your entire population,
it's a lot of dough.
That's very expensive.
Yep. So, Chris, I have a question for you. So, if I'm an investor who does investing in China, obviously my big concern about this whole thing is, are my transactions going to be covered? And so the rumors are things like battery technology and biotech will not be included. What have you heard about what is included, what's not included?
Well, Brett, one of the easiest ways to look at that is first to bridge the gap from what Kerr was saying about the political and geopolitical environment to understand what the Trump administration and now the Biden administration have really been after with both CFIUS and reverse CFIUS. And if you think about it from a national security perspective rather than a business perspective, if you stand in the government's shoes for a minute, during the Cold War, CFIUS was all about national security, as were the export control laws.
Right.
During the global war on terrorism, CFIUS was about national security, but also homeland security. So suddenly stuff like critical infrastructure became really important. It wasn't just aerospace and defense anymore. Well, now it's moved from national security to homeland security to industrial security. And the United States, since the end of World War II, like to pretend that it didn't have an industrial security policy and that it was all for open markets and free trade and all the rest. And as we've seen the global economy sort of shift from, patterns of globalization to patterns of regionalization, we're starting to see first the Trump administration and the Biden administration really go hard on this industrial policy, whether it's cracking down on export control violations, whether it's imposing sanctions, whether it's CFIUS, whether it's the CHIPS Act. With respect to reverse CFIUS, the easiest way to understand what the Biden administration is likely to have on its priority lists in terms of outbound investment from the United States into China are to look at the same things that the government's worried about when the Chinese invest here. And that is to say certain categories of technology, certain infrastructure issues, and certain data and privacy issues. So primarily, if we look at technology, it's going to be anything that's related to weapons, right? That's all prohibited. Yep. And so looking at any kind of interface between a U.S. investor in a Chinese company and the Chinese military industrial complex, that's going to be a primary priority for the Biden administration. But, if we get away from the weapons world and we look at the dual use technology world, something as simple as an iPhone may not seem like a dangerous idea, but there's a lot of technology in here that could be transferred to a Chinese party, even if it's a Chinese intermediary, and then leaked out into the Chinese ecosystem. And so when you look at dual use technology, the stuff that's not weapons, but is nonetheless export controlled, you're going to see that be a high priority as well. Infrastructure, that's really not likely to be an issue. It's a big issue for Homeland Security purposes here in the United States. But for outbound investment, I don't think that's likely to be on the ledger for the Biden administration. We'll have to wait and see. But one area we're also likely to see become quite important will be anything related to sensitive personal data. And what does that capture? That's going to capture healthcare. That's going to capture life sciences. That's going to capture biotech. Not just the transfer of technology and know-how and IP and all the rest that we normally think about, but also the possibility of transferring personally identifiable information, like insurance information or health information, or even just, your address and your name and your social security number. So all those things, those privacy-related concerns that we see CFIUS really digging into in China, directed investments into the United States, we're likely to see those same data and privacy and healthcare concerns added onto the technology issues we discussed earlier.
Makes sense. So Louie, I want to bring you in on this. So you're seated in the heart of Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, California. And as you said, there's certainly in Silicon Valley, Asian capital, Asian IP, Asian partnerships are a big part of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. So what are you hearing from your clients in terms of concerns, lack of concern, et cetera?
Yeah, so when people think about CFIUS, they typically think about an Asian investor, specifically a Chinese investor, writing a check into their company, taking a board seat, perhaps, having some information rights, being able to look into the technology that's being built here in the Silicon Valley, or that's being built from here, and we have more public and private companies in a 50-mile radius here than anywhere in the world. Yep. We have major universities, major technology companies, and those companies have been trying to access the Chinese market for many years. And one of the reasons I'm so happy to have Kerr here is he was effectively the ambassador for U.S. business trying to get into China. And when he was leading the AmCham, he would be the first stop when you're planning a trip to China to how do I get meetings with the national government? How do I get meetings with regional governments? Who do I talk to if I want to set up a factory? That's Kerr. And that's what he did. And he's coming out with a book about how to do business in China in light of this environment, which I want to talk about more. But why is this topic relevant for our audience today is that whether you are a venture capital firm, a startup, a large tech company, you require access to the China market in order for your product to really go from garage to global, as I say here in this little background, if I can point to it right. And soon enough it will be, if not the largest, already it is one of the most important consumer markets in the world. And so when we go in to access a market, we always think, do we go direct and just sell directly to consumers from our headquarters here? Do we set up a branch? Do we set up a subsidiary? What's the best way? And over time, we've learned that the best way to access Chinese consumers is to partner with a local Chinese entity, create what we call a WOOFie, or a joint venture, and for that entity to sell products to Chinese investors, and that means, consumers, and that means we've got to get technology from here into Silicon Valley, and that's controlled by export regimes. And now, when we want to just put money into China and other countries, that is going to be reviewed by this Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which will have a new name, but it's an interagency committee made up of members of the Treasury Department and the National Security Agencies and the Commerce Department and others who get together and look at whether this investment into the U.S. is going to hurt national security or whether it should be cleared. And now they're going to look at investments going from the U.S. into China and say, is that okay? And so that's why we've got this group. And I want to bring in my good friend H.K. Park from Crumpton, who's here, as he and I have been helping a lot of investors look at those investments into China and what is the risk profile of those investments into China, and what's the risk and how do we manage it. And HK, rather than me tell this story, I would love to have you bring you in here and help explain to our audience what is the risk that you're trying to help identify.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Louie. I think the risk relates to what their incoming regulation might be, and as you and Chris discussed, there's a lot of ambiguity still about what technologies might be included, whether it includes, semiconductors, robotics, AI, biotech, for example, but also the scope of the new regulation. But even though there's some ambiguity, there are some areas we can actually start planning now and thinking ahead. If you're a venture capital firm or a corporate venture capital firm or a pension, and let's say, have 30 or 40 Chinese tech companies in your portfolio, there are certain screens you can apply to look at those companies and figure out, from the defense perspective, which ones have supplier or customer relationships with the Chinese military, which ones receive funding from the Chinese military or intelligence agencies, which ones have ultimate beneficial ownership tied to Chinese state-owned enterprise, for example, or which ones have technologies that could be used or applied for defense or intelligence purposes. That's one element. The other is economic, which I think Kerr referred to as well. It's this broader question of, does $1 invested in China benefit China economically compared to the US if that dollar were invested here? So it's a very expansive definition of national security. So it could be in a very zero-sum perspective of the world as well. But there's some members of Congress who are criticizing investors who are, quote unquote, investing in our enemy, and are trying to find ways to curb investment into key drivers of the future economy, like semiconductors, for example, or quantum computing, or even commercial space. So look at that as well. Another area is reputational. While the investment in a certain Chinese company might be legal, it might be very hard to defend on the front pages of the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. It just doesn't sound right to the general public, and it's hard to explain the investment. And another area is legal, and my friends at Foley can talk more about this, but questions of foreign direct product rule, sanctions, export controls on certain technologies that companies are investing right now in China.
So if I could just ask you to really boil it down here, HK, zooming out to 30,000 feet in the air, why is it important for our audience to be aware of reverse CFIUS, and what is the cost of doing nothing and not getting ahead of what we think is coming?
So the regulation may or may not block future investments in certain technologies. We don't know yet, right? It may affect penalties for U.S. investors as well. They may go back in time to look at past investments too, depending upon how they define an investment. The cost of doing nothing may be that you may have to publicize or notify the U.S. government about your investments in China, and that notification may become public so that members of Congress or the media or certain watchdogs might profile your company or your investment firm about your investments in certain companies. And so you have a reputational risk as well of potential problematic investments in China. So those are kind of the main concerns, either regulatory, including punitive U.S. government, and reputational.
So just to follow up on that, let's say you're a U.S. business looking to sell, let's say, electric vehicles in China, and you've got a majority-owned subsidiary in China, and you're starting your investment plan to be able to manufacture cars and deliver them in the country. Maybe have concessions, places that you sell them, dealerships. If you embark on that now, and then the regulation comes into place, you might be prohibited from funding that plan and putting yourself in some jeopardy there. You might be committed to putting some technology there which isn't legal, and which can get you into some hot water. What if you put U.S. employees there? What does that look like? And I think that we all think about, the U.S. government regulation, and what I've learned from Kerr is that every time there's a U.S. government regulation, there will be a corresponding Chinese regulation, and so it's a very complex web. And we say this, and I heard the word enemy. I think that it's very important that we look at our other markets in the business context as places where we can be successful. And American business has been very successful in competing in the global environment, and how we can help enable that. And so Kerr, I would love to hear from you as to how you would advise a U.S. business that's looking to access the China market right now, and how should they go ahead and do that, knowing that reverse CFIUS is coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Louie. And also thanks for the plug on my book. I appreciate it. The folks at Palgrave Macmillan will be very grateful. It does come out in May, and it's called Selling to China. So appreciate that. But H.K. Park actually just said something that got everybody's attention, which is that reverse CFIUS may impact past investments. That is a huge that would
be a big deal. Yeah.
That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Because when you think about the stock of investment that's already been made, right? I mean, GM, Coca-Cola, it's enormous, and as Christopher pointed out, some of these have national security implications. Some of them nobody would have thought, but look how many iPhones are made in China. So, here I want to make another point about reverse CFIUS and what's going on here, and how it can impact the business community that's in China already. So there's a link here between export controls and reverse CFIUS, and Louie and I have talked to some of his clients about this. It gets their attention when you think about export controls. We understand why they're there, but one of the responses that American businesses have taken to when the U.S. government says, X company, the technology that you developed in the U.S., you cannot use that in China. What's the logical response? Well, to a global company that views China as its number one or number two growth market globally, they're already in China. They're already doing R&D in China. What are you going to do logically if you're sitting in headquarters at a large American company? You're going to say, well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to move my R&D from the United States of America into China. That's a direct response. And I'm not saying that every company is doing that, or that's the response in every situation, but that is the response in many cases, that they simply move that R&D into China. And so reverse CFIUS in a way is going to plug that gap. So what we're seeing in China is American companies, the multinationals, are really beefing up their at the point that you made earlier, Louie. Like what's the cost of ignoring this? They can't ignore it. It cannot be ignored. You have to beef up your compliance teams, your legal teams. You've got to get ahead of this. Otherwise, again, it could be an existential threat when you think about getting crossed up in the U.S. government. And by the way, European companies as well. All these things are linked. So the European companies are paying a lot of attention to this as well, because they can also get crossed up.
So I have a question for the law dogs on this call. So in a transaction, an investment transaction, there's frequently a whole bunch of different parties, right? There's multiple investors. There's an investment bank involved. There's law firms are involved. Yada yada yada. Who has the reporting obligation on this?
Good question.
So under
the bankers and lawyers go like this, right?
Well, Brett, this is Christopher. Let me take a stab at that question, right? So we don't know who has the reporting obligation for reverse CFIUS, because at the moment, as we are speaking, unless something has happened since we got on the line together, there is no reverse CFIUS rule or regulation or executive order. Once that drops, we'll have a sense of what's on the album. But until then, the best way for us to think about this is to think about what CFIUS would require. CFIUS requires the investor and the target to make a disclosure. Or in the event that the target no longer exists, so the target is just assets, or the target has been acquired and it's after the fact, then the investor in certain instances carries the weight of the disclosure. So it's reasonable to presume that the US investor in China or in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia, whatever other country we may be worried about, will carry the burden for notification. In terms of your deal flow, when is the right time to start thinking about this? As soon as you've got an LOI, right? When we are looking at normal CFIUS, if you are delaying the CFIUS analysis until normal diligence, you are too late, because CFIUS has significant implications for transaction strategy and transactions timing. So at the letter of intent phase, or whatever the equivalent is for the transaction that you're doing, that's when you want your CFIUS team, whether it's inside or outside counsel, or skilled consultants like Crumpton or other experts, to come in and help you evaluate this. Because if you get too far down the road in a transaction and you discover the CFIUS issues too far in, you can have some pretty uncomfortable commercial and regulatory circumstances. Why does it make sense to pay attention to this stuff now, proactively rather than reactively? Well, first off, if we look at CFIUS and its current capacity to do ex post facto or post-closing reviews of foreign investments in the United States, I can tell you, having defended a bunch of those, that they are substantially more rigorous, substantially more prosecutorial in terms of the outlook, and that the cost to the parties is usually between 3 and 10 times higher than it would be for a normal CFIUS, a proactive CFIUS filing. I'd expect that if you're dealing with that in a reverse CFIUS context, where you're unwinding decades of investments that have already been made, that you're looking at some pretty long and legally pretty expensive proceedings potentially. One other thing I want to say quickly before I hand back to Louie to talk about the deal implications. Here's a taxonomy sort of riffing on some of the things that HK was thinking about earlier as to where the risks are, from highest risk to lowest risk, right? So if you're a venture capital fund or a family office or a pension fund or something else, here's the highest risk: anything involving the People's Liberation Army or the Chinese military industrial complex. If you're investing directly or indirectly into that world, expect a world of pain. The second is anything involving the Chinese government, right? And that includes not just the national government and all of the places where it has tentacles, but also the provincial governments, getting back to something that Kerr was saying earlier. Provincial governments, that's often where a lot of the action is in terms of economic development, but they're also treated as if they were the national government when it comes to the U.S. national security community. So first, the PLA and the Chinese military-industrial complex, then the Chinese government. Then after that, any state-owned enterprises, which is a substantial component of the Chinese economy, including especially automotive and manufacturing, as well as healthcare and high tech. And then after that, everything else. So if you need a taxonomy, military stuff, Chinese government stuff, state-owned enterprises, everything else. And that's probably going to be an inverted pyramid of risk.
Right.
I don't know whether it's going to be in the regulations or in the executive order, but if I were giving you a 411 on what to prioritize I'd prioritize it in that way.
Great.
That's a great summary, and I wanted to kind of pivot this into the context that our audience finds themselves in, where they already have operations there, or they're going to put operations there. There's technology involved, and there's movements of money. And so, each of those demands a different analysis. And I think it would be useful to speak about this in a hypothetical context. So I've kind of came up with some hypotheticals for us to talk about. And I think just zooming out, I think our audience probably finds themselves in one of two situations. They already have operations there in China or some investment, or they want to make one to be able to access Chinese customers, which, from a business perspective, I think is our goal. And so if you already have operations in China, you either are majority or you're minority. You either have U.S. employees there or you don't, and you have only locals. And you either have money going in or money coming out and hopefully money coming out. But I think the CFIUS here is going to talk about, or the reverse CFIUS is going to be about money going in. And Kerr and HK, what is our risk analysis, and how do we advise U.S. investors of how to think about what to do about their existing operations in this context? So if you need to be funding an operation, and you've gone through this taxonomy that Christopher has laid out for us, then what? HK.
Yeah.
Right. So, back to your other question, Louie, about, what's the risk of doing nothing? What the VCs tell me is that they don't want to be in a situation where the regulation drops tomorrow and they're forced to divest at a loss, right? They rather do their homework now, understand which ones are at risk, and if necessary, divest in advance of the regulation coming out. In your hypothetical, Louie, as we've all been talking about, the regulation has not coming out tomorrow. It's still being formed. So we don't know exactly whether investment in an operation in China would be affected, or purely, a VC or pension investment would be part of the purview.
Great point. So we might need to divest, and we might need to divest partially or entirely. And I think that is an important thing to think about. Is there some solution where you're a 2/3 owner, or maybe you're 100% owner, and you become a 49% owner? I think that has massive implications on what is your return on that capital that you're investing. If you're only going to be getting 49 cents back, from an accounting perspective, you can't consolidate that anymore. At least not entirely. You're only going to be able to consolidate, how much you control. So it would be 49%. You'd be going from 100 to 49 cents, and that's a big change. And then there's the people issue. And Kerr, you and I have talked about this. If you're a U.S. employee of a U.S. owned subsidiary in China, how are you feeling right now?
Yeah, you're feeling nervous. I think U.S. employees and Chinese employees are nervous in this environment. Everybody is feeling uncomfortable. There's no question about it. And to back your question about what's the exercise that you need to take if you're doing an inbound investment right now. And by the way, I think an inbound investment right now is great timing for two reasons. One is they need the investment, so you're never going to get a better deal than you're going to get right now. So if you have, frankly, the cojones to go into China right now, great idea. Second, you're going to see a consumer spending bump. Everybody's sort of focused on the past in 2022 and how horrible the economy was, which it was. I mean, 3% growth, is I was actually predicting even lower, but they're coming in at about 3%. You're going to see a consumer spending like you've never seen before in the coming months, especially through the new year and beyond, just because there's so much pent up demand. But part of the exercise when you're thinking about reverse CFIUS and thinking about your investment now is also a good time to think about the overall structure and how much capital you're committing. To Louie's point about structure, are you 49%? Are you 51%? Do you need to consolidate? The other thing to think about, and this is unpleasant, but we kind of have to think about the catastrophic event. And again, I don't think it's I'm sitting here in Taiwan. I feel perfect. I think that's a problem, but the catastrophic event is the elephant in every room. And one of the things that Louie and I have talked about in his clients is the idea of hard assets in China and trying to avoid the situation that a lot of American companies found themselves in Russia, for example. They had the catastrophic event in Ukraine, and a lot of American companies found themselves holding assets that were very inconvenient to be on their balance sheet. So if you're doing an
I think we lost Christopher. He'll be back, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm slightly worried because he was just talking about catastrophic events and then he was gone.
I know.
Not funny, Brett.
It certainly underscores the point.
Well, let me just try and flip back this to Christopher and HK. We recently went through this catastrophic event with Russia and our sanctions being applied to business that continued there. And Christopher, what did that look like for some U.S. businesses who had operations in Russia? What did they have to do then, and where are they now?
Yeah, so my team between February of 2022 and the present, all 340 whatever days it is, we have helped relocate about 24 major multinationals who had to shut everything down in Russia, either because they couldn't process any payments through the Russian financial system anymore, because all the Russian banks that are worth doing business with are now sanctioned or cut off from the SWIFT network or elsewise. They soon will be unable to pay taxes or tariffs or any kind of fees to the Russian Treasury, the Russian Ministry of Finance, right? Everything just sort of cascaded for them. And there were a series of very, very tight deadlines that they had to meet based on the limited authorizations that US Treasury and other US government agencies got. So what we wound up doing was literally cascading every one of the steps they had to take and locating first people offshore as quickly as we possibly could, especially people in the technology and software space. Then locating IP and other key strategic assets for companies offshore, mothballing existing operations until they could be sold to somebody who wasn't sanctioned, running some really crazy diligence on the parties that were purchasing those mothballed assets and making sure that the purchases could be done in a way that didn't violate US, Canadian, British, or EU sanctions, which, by the way, are as joined up as any sanctions programs ever. I used to prosecute sanctions cases at Treasury, and I can tell you we've never seen anything like this before in terms of the degree to which our allies in the United States are linked up. And look, for most of our clients, in addition to dealing with the legal risks and the major commercial losses, we also dealt with massive reputational risk.
Yeah.
Right? Massive reputational risk, where some days we'd be fighting to we'd be calling the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the Washington Post to keep our clients out of the headlines because they were trying to do the right thing, but they couldn't do it fast enough without putting Russian employees at risk. So you get into these really difficult situations where you've got to turn on a dime, and where the Russian law and the US law contradict one another, and there's a lot of tension, and complying with US law requires violating Russian law, and it's a mess. It's great if you're a lawyer and you make, your living clean, solving problems for clients, but if you're the client dealing with that problem, it is a world of pain and you want to avoid it. So like Russia and China, there's sort of 5 key questions to ask when you start building up a relationship. And they're the same questions you learned in elementary school: who, what, where, when, why, and how, right? Who is the investment target or your business partner? What do they do for a living? Or rephrased, as HK might put it, what do they actually do for a living? Where are they located? Now, note that we normally ask the where question first because we like to take a country-based analysis to this stuff. But there are plenty of perfectly fine investment targets and perfectly fine companies in high-risk countries. So the country are usually a yellow light, but the who is the investment target. That's usually the red light. So first, who's the investment target? What do they actually do for a living? Where are they located, right? Then why do they need your investment? Right? Why do they need your investment? They can do something weird with it. They can do something strange with your technology. And then the last question, if I'm an investor and I'm going into one of these higher risk environments, I want to know how much oversight and control I'm going to have. And in a country like Russia, it became very clear that US companies, US investors, they had no control or oversight as soon as the Putin regime decided to drop the hammer. And we know in China that the level of oversight and control that a US investor can have will be very low. We deal with joint ventures all the time, especially joint ventures where the Chinese party is a state-owned enterprise. And the Chinese Communist Party representative on the Chinese joint venture for the Chinese joint venture company has substantially more oversight and control than the foreign national employee, deployed to China by the U.S.-based multinational. So who is the investment target? What do they really do for a living? Where are they located? Why do they need your investment? And how much oversight and control will you have? If you're looking to mitigate your risk and get the hell out of Dodge fast, like some of my clients in Russia had to, those are the 5 questions to ask.
Right. So HK, I'd love to hear more about your firm and what we are doing together to help our clients get ready for what might be coming down the pike. What's a tabletop exercise? What's a portfolio review analysis look like? And what are some of the recommendations that are being made to some of these folks who have investments, or that we could potentially make to somebody who might have investments in some of those folks that Christopher has identified?
Sure. So tabletop exercise is basically a classroom type exercise whereby you stress test the C-suite ideally and put before them a scenario, for example, a Chinese blockade of Taiwan by ship and air. And what does that mean for the company's operations, for their businesses, for their supply chain, and help them kind of experience living through the experience, what that means for them and how do you actually learn lessons from that experience, right? Which we've done with Foley and your clients as well to help them experience that firsthand. It's much more impactful, I think, for people to experience that stress test as opposed to reading about it. On the portfolio review, it's what I mentioned before. It's actually taking the time now while you can to look at the portfolio in China and figure out which ones might be problematic based upon what we know so far in terms of what the U.S. government cares about. Kerr, you said that my statement about past investments probably terrified a lot of people, and let me expand upon that. So depending upon how the regulations are written, if the fine print says that a new investment is defined as a new investment or a Series B investment once the company reaches a milestone, that's problematic for a lot of investors, I think. Or if it includes rebalancing of the portfolio in China, that could qualify as a new investment. So I think the fine print will really matter here when the regulation comes out. The number of other uncertainties. Number one is whether or not they're going to just purely require notification to the government of the investment, or whether they're going to have blocking authority like CFIUS to block a deal, to block an investment firm from investing in a certain company. And maybe it's a hybrid. Maybe it's blocking authority only for investments in the semiconductor industry, but everything else requires notification. That could be the hybrid outcome.
Well, I find it very ironic that at a time in history where there is more trade between the United States and China than there has ever been before, there are fewer, what I'll call M&A or investment transactions that are happening than in the last 20 years. And we have this, potential reverse CFIUS coming down the pike. HK, it would be really helpful if you could tell us, where it stands. So for everyone's benefit, it started out with a piece of legislation, I believe, in the Senate. And I believe it was Senator Conran, a Republican from Texas, who was sponsoring, and I may have gotten that wrong, so correct me. And then it morphed into this potential executive order. And tell us a little bit more about that, HK.
So there are parallel tracks. There's a Casey Cornyn bill, which is the draft legislation sponsored by both the Democrat and the Republican. It's a very bipartisan issue, which didn't make into a law in the fall, but still has potential to make into a law this spring. Parallel to that congressional effort is the White House pushing this executive order, which can just be a regulation issued by the White House without requiring the force of law. And both are kind of competing with each other for which one will come out first. And I think the executive order is much easier to issue without a lot of negotiation between the different parties on the Hill. There's some speculation that might come out in the next 30, 60 days. A law will take longer to enact, but there's a lot of momentum behind both efforts. And again, as I mentioned, all this is a continuation of the Trump administration. This is one area where Democrats and Republicans agree upon, which is limiting technology access by China. And so you see this is continuation of a Trump policy, which the Biden folks have adopted and actually expanded upon. to the surprise of many.
So it sounds like legislation is going to be tough because despite there being a bipartisan consensus, there are a lot of folks who oppose this. Probably in American business and even maybe other sectors of the populace or the demography here. What's driving the U.S. presidential order and the timing of it today, HK?
Well, timing wise, I think they want to get it done last year. I understand there's kind of internal negotiations within the Biden administration between the Treasury Department, Commerce Department, and the National Security Agencies as to how far they should go with the executive order. So I think that's kind of delaying the issuance of the executive order. What's driving it generally, though, is that they want to find some way to what they call put some curbs on the financial investment into China, right? Some people call this the weaponization of finance. We're trying to find ways to limit U.S. investment into capital-intensive industries like semiconductors that are critical for both commercial and defense purposes.
Kerr, what's the view of American business on this potential piece of legislation or executive order?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think whatever it was, it's going to be if the concept of reviewing past investments really if that makes it into the headlines, I think their posture is going to change just because there is so much capital already invested there. I think also there's back to one of Chris's comments about control. And the different structures of American business over there. And I think there's more and more realization that given the new environment, meaning national security really dominating the context here, I think American companies are feeling less and less in control. And I think, again, that should influence their thought process in terms of their enthusiasm for the wholly owned subsidiary, right? That's always been the push-pull, right? In early days, it drove people crazy that they were forced into these joint ventures because they didn't have control. Now they're kind of realizing, well, we don't have control anyway. So the joint venture actually starts looking much more attractive. The other thing to bring up is something that Louie brought up before, which was the countervailing measure, the right term, but as the U.S. government comes up with these export controls and policies, China doesn't sit still. I mean, they have their own regulations that and oftentimes they're designed to protect the Chinese party from what they perceive as being an unfair, unreasonable U.S. measure. And so one example of that is something called the 不可靠实体中清单, so that unreliable entities list is what they call it in Chinese. And so this was literally the counterparty of the entity list that the Commerce Department maintains. So there's those kinds of things that U.S. businesses in China really need to pay attention to. So to HK Park's suggestion to do these tabletop exercises, that's one of the reasons to do that, is because if you look at it in a vacuum, you're only facing one way. You're reading up on the U.S. regulations. Well, what happens on the Chinese side that reacts to that? So all that has to be put into context. And just one last thing if we don't have people's attention yet, back to the question of U.S. personnel. So China has, and I don't want to scare anybody here, but if we get upside down in a legal spat, and there's disagreements about how to pull this thing apart or who's responsible, who's damaged by what regulation was unreasonable, which one wasn't. Keep in mind, China uses this concept called an exit ban, which basically keeps the U.S. citizen in place in China, not in jail, but in China, within the borders of China, cannot leave until this issue is resolved. So keep that in mind as you think about how many expats you've got in China, and you don't want to get into a legal dispute over there. You do not, and your expat staff definitely don't want to be involved in that.
So now that Kerr has thoroughly scared us all, we've got to wrap.
HK started it. I didn't start it.
We've got to wrap this up in about 2 minutes, guys. So I have a couple of really quick questions. So one is that we spent most of this conversation talking about China, but the regulation is likely to also impact investments in other countries and regions as well. Is that accurate? And do we know, is this China, Russia,
It'll probably say, countries that are adverse to the U.S., so China, Russia, North Korea, Iran.
Okay.
But one of the things that's important to note is, this stuff only works because there's an exception to the WTO rules called the fundamental security exception, right? Where you basically say national security trumps our WTO obligations.
Yeah. Right.
And that fundamental security exception has become more fundamental over time. It's kind of like my cat. It keeps getting bigger and bigger the more we feed it. So when you look at fundamental security exception and you look at the list of countries, obviously it's going to be the sanctioned countries, the countries that are state sponsors of terrorism, but also look at the BRICS generally. Look at the Middle East, especially UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, because of geopolitical reasons, and also because some of them have been a little friendly with Putin lately, and the Biden administration doesn't like that. And don't take India off the table. India is a pretty big country with a lot of dynamism, and it's growing faster than China is right now, at least in terms of population.
Right.
So I'd expect India to be on the table as well, especially because India historically has been a backdoor to Russia in terms of military and technology flows.
And now the number one financier of the Putin regime with their purchases of discounted Russian oil. But Brett, I know we're coming up at time.
Yeah.
I want to thank this awesome group of panelists for gracing us
great
today. And also want to invite folks to reach out to any of them or us at Foley or Brett at Fourthly about how to navigate what is coming down the pike. And we've hopefully given everyone a lot of ideas and food for thought. Brett?
Yeah, thanks, Louie. I was just going to say, I think you can probably find all of us on LinkedIn. So if there's anything we can do to help, reach out to us. Thanks to all of you for attending, and especially thanks to our expert panelists for joining at various time zones around the world. And Kerr, I think you just stepped off a plane recently, so you've got both a time zone issue and a jet lag issue, both.
Good news is I'm up in the middle of the night anyway. So
Nice. All right. Thanks very much to you all.
Good. A pleasure. Thank you.